Hi, everybody. Dr. Friedman here. Welcome to week 3 of Games and Stories. This week, we're talking about interactive fiction, dialing back a little bit to some of the kind of generic cousins of role playing games. So, to do that, we are reading across the whole week. Jennifer Grueling covers initial chapters of the creation of narrative in tabletop role playing games. And I like those starting chapters because they set up some really useful terms and concepts that are broader than just role playing games, which is what are genres? How do genres work? Um, and what are narrative levels and how do they work? Students got a little bit of a taste of that in my kind of updated version when I was writing about Critical Role last week. But Jennifer Grueling, as she now goes by, really sets this up, over a decade ago in terms that are still incredibly useful. So, in order to think about genre and genre formation and non-linear fiction, we took a look at Borges's short story from the 1940s that was translated into English in the 1960s, The Guarding of Forking Paths. And this is something that Jennifer Grueling mentions as a kind of touchstone in her chapter, in one of her initial chapters. It's also been adapted into a kind of mini game on itch.io and has a digital edition that shows off the multiple editions in English of the short story. It was fascinating because I gave students basically no kind of explainer to why we were reading this or what it was. I just gave it to them in a digital edition on Perusall. And so it was fascinating to look at the annotations, and you can actually watch students who are annotating while they read kind of slowly, try to figure out, is this nonfiction? Borges includes this kind of sense of verisimilitude in the start of The Garden of Forking Paths. 2 pages have been removed. This is part of a kind of historical document in some way, shape, or form. There's a footnote at the end. It's a work of fiction, and it's a work of fiction that some students initially thought was somehow the reporting of a play, like a game setup or scenario, or a report from a session of a game. Because we set up all kinds of expectations about something that we're reading or watching or listening to or viewing based on context. And in this case, the context was this is a game class on game stories. They're reading it for class. And so, our brains fill in the pieces, especially since, in terms of the kind of paratext, the stuff around a text that gives us a cue as to what we're looking at and what we're consuming, there wasn't a whole lot. It's not, immediately obvious from the way that the text is laid out what it is. So we talked about, the kinds of expectations that physical form gives us or doesn't give us in particular kinds of modes. And of course, I did tell them, and they, I think, realized by the end of the reading experience that this was a work of fiction, but a strange work of fiction, a work of fiction that is thinking metafictionally about the nature of fiction. Because it's all about this kind of mysterious labyrinth that is a novel that is a labyrinth, that our kind of narrative voice, our protagonist, their ancestor created, and so that somehow weaves into this kind of plot that is also because this kind of discussion between two characters about the multiplicity of possibility, even as the narrative itself kind of moves towards what feels like, at least for the main character, this inevitable ending that must occur. even while there's such a meditation on all of these kinds of possibilities. Um, and I think that's and so one of the things that I talked about in class was the fact that, of course, Borges is part of a fictional tradition that he's always playing with these kinds of elements of, you know, what is fiction and how does it work? What are the possibilities that the 20th century is increasingly aware of in terms of, the time space continuum and multiple universes and possibilities? And all these kind of philosophical meditations that the text itself both explicitly as well as in its form meditate on. And I use that as a way into starting to think about non-linear ways of telling stories that are more participatory. So as we're going to discuss more on Thursday when we really dive into Grueling's work, because I wanted to give students a chance to really come back to Grueling so that we can address that work more fully on Thursday, because in case you don't know, the situation in which we are currently in is not only are we in a pandemic, we're not far from the Gulf Coast and a major hurricane has just hit. And while we are fine, we have family connections and connections of networks of care. So we're all a little bit distracted at this particular moment in time. So justice is tempered with mercy. We'll get to Grueling cover more robustly on Thursday. So instead, I pivoted from Borges, which is a work of fiction that is both stable in many ways, but also multiple. We talked about versioning and additions and these sorts of things that even texts we think of as stable are not, to a truly interactive text of the kind that Grueling is talking about on her way to thinking about the nature of tabletop role-playing games. So we played a bit of the solo RPG by Tim Hutchings, The 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. And I love this game. I love this book object. It's incredibly beautiful. I've, of course, featured images of it in previous videos as we've built up to this. We're going to talk to Tim later on in the semester. So this was the initial seed planting. And I decided that rather than have students kind of go off and do this kind of game all by themselves, I did not assign the entire text. I did not have students buy this book. So here's how I've done this. I've excerpted, the initial rules and a very small fraction of the prompts, and I put those on perusal in a PDF. And what we did for about 45 minutes, so about half of our class time, was I walked through, as the kind of audiobook version, a walkthrough of the rules. And so everybody had a copy. We have a lot of laptops in the room. So everybody opened up or got near someone else who had a device. We got out, either a file in a word processing software or a sheet of paper or a notebook, and we got ready and I read out the rules. And the rules, of course, are a walkthrough of how you start to create the character before you start rolling the prompts. So for those of you who don't know, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire is a solo RPG. Shut Up and Sit Down has done a really great review, which I'll link in the notes, of what gameplay is like. But the point is that it's first you create several qualities of your vampire, and you end at the start of the prompt part of the game with a character that has several mortal character connections, several traits, 5 memories, and from there it's going to be a question of addition and loss. That this is a game that's very much about memory, and that memory is unstable. Especially if you are a 1,000-year-old vampire. And so once initial character creation occurs, then you roll a d10, a 10-sided die, and a 6-sided die, and subtract the one number from the other. If the number is positive, you move forward that number of prompts. If it's negative, you move backwards, and if it's 0, you answer the same prompt again, which I find really interesting. So from there, students were given just about 10 minutes by the end of class, to start to explore those initial prompts. And we came together in the last 5 minutes just to kind of get a very quick initial impression. We're going to come back to this, and students have the ability to take this on as one of their tasks for the semester, to play a couple more hours of Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. If students want to play the full game, then I have pointed to the itch.io page for Tim. And if they can't personally afford it, then they can come and talk to me, and I will get them a copy, legally and with compensation for the artist. I want to make sure that everyone has access, and no one feels deprived, but also that Tim gets all of the credit that he deserves. So that's the kind of balance that I'm striking. Some folks are going to, kind of stop at those kinds of initial prompts and feel like they've had enough experience. But my hope is that enough of them will be intrigued that they'll keep going. And so in a couple of weeks, we'll come back, and they've been asked to, when they finish playing, to save their document, and at the end of their document, to write some questions that come up, things they want to ask Tim, as we hopefully engage with him as a designer and thinker. It went really well. It was, compared to something like For the Queen, it's a much more intensive amount of class time to devote to a single game, but I think it's worth doing. I also set up some background music. I didn't think about this too far ahead of time, so I just pulled one of my 18th century instrumental mixes for some historical-esque background noise. If I was doing this in October, maybe I'd go a little bit more spooky. You could kind of go in a lot of different directions with that, but it broke up the kind of dead silence, so to speak, of the room, which I find is often useful pedagogically, even when you're not trying to kind of get an ambient noise just so that students will start talking to each other. Sometimes it's even useful in these kinds of tasks. So the sound of rolling dice and quiet scratches. Students were reporting doing, even in just those 10 minutes of answering prompts, which, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 prompts they were able to get to, the most ambitious of them. But they had already done kind of unspeakable and shocking things that they were excitedly mentioning to me at the end of class, which was very, very cool. So in addition, I'll include in the links below the after class interlude. Chris at Loot the Room very recently wrote a really lovely review essay that is a nice kind of bridge back to our time with Mix Tiffany Lee, The Memory of a Vampire, and thinking about what is this game and how it connects to the kind of interesting art object that Tim also sold, that has had some interesting kind of dialogue around it. Because it's this non-textual object. It's not a game. What is it? Discourse. I'll also include the other things that I sent to students for kind of after class kind of meditation, which is Eric Zimmerman's Life in the Garden, which Tim actually mentioned on Twitter right before class, which is an infinitely reshuffleable card-based story. It's functionally no longer available. There is a link to buy it on Amazon, but as of this recording, it was like $800. So like that is not actually feasible. But a bunch of the cards and parts of the project exist on an Instagram account, which I'll link below. And then R.A. Carter's The Garden of Forking Paths, which is an indie game version of the Borges story by the same name. So on Thursday, we're going to kind of bridge from these experiences into interactive fiction and things that are kind of driven by stuff like Twine. So students are reading Addie Robertson's Text Adventures, How Twine Remade Gaming from this year, a blog post about the ideology of ludology and narratology in the study of analog play and games, which is just a kind of quick explainer for folks who need the reinforcement from grueling cover about the debates about ludology versus narratology, which we can talk about more in class. Obviously, this class is very heavily in the narratology camp, but we acknowledge that, you know, the farmer and the cowman can be friends, and it doesn't have to be one or the other, that the two kind of can exist in harmony. This is often a false binary, but it's a binary with a history. Students are being asked for the first time to play something before class. In this case, they've been given the option of one of two kind of major pieces of interactive fiction that are easily available online. Proper teen charity Heartscape's Howling Dogs from 2010, which is often seen as kind of an important stage in the development of these kinds of interactive fiction, and Matthew S. Burns' The Writer Will Do Something, which is a nice meditation on video game development. So, and that's from 2017. So in class, we're going to talk theory, we're going to talk ideas, we're going to talk about game experiences, and we will also play around with twinery.org, which is one of the ways that you can create a story with twine. And I'll show off some of the work that Emily and I have been doing with this kind of ambitious project that we don't know what the end of it will be, but we're trying to write an academic article in Twine. So we're trying to write a nonlinear academic piece. Stay tuned on that one. It gets real weird. It's us thinking about 18th century games, but that's for another video. You can see us talking about that kind of stuff on other places in the channel. So this is kind of the shape of this week. I will make a note, and so my students who just need to know what was going on, you can go and see you soon. It's almost Thursday. But for folks who are interested in how this course is being structured, I just wanted to make one more note. This is another set of readings where I realize, and I said this on Twitter, but I'm going to kind of make this instantiated here because this is a little bit more durable. I'm quickly realizing that this class is haunted by Dungeons and Dragons in a way that I'm going to have to address in another iteration of this course. So the next time I teach this class, which seems almost inevitable at this point, it's possibly an honors research seminar or something along those lines. So even if my department doesn't necessarily let me teach it as a particular course number, we have a mechanism here at Auburn where faculty can teach an additional course that's kind of research focused in our honors college. So I'm thinking a lot about what I will do differently next time, because next time seems very, very likely. And I think I've got a set of branching paths. One option is to continue to commit to the idea that I don't want D&D to eat the class, which means that these first couple of weeks I'll have to remove and put later the theoretical stuff. Because what I'm realizing more and more as I look at all the theoretical readings and what students focus on is all of the examples are from Dungeons and Dragons. And there's really no way around it. And if you know out there ideas of secondary lit that thinks about tabletop role-playing games and defines terms and explains stuff and doesn't freaking talk about Dungeons and Dragons as the first touchstone, let me know. That would be really great. But for now, the state of play, so to speak, is that when you talk about role-playing games in a scholarly context, the first touchstone is Dungeons and Dragons. It's seen as the origin point, and thus everything flows from it. So one option is just to say, okay, we're not going to talk about tabletop role-playing scholarship for the first couple of weeks. Instead, we're going to talk more generically. Maybe I can talk about Borges, and not tie it directly to grueling cover just yet. We can play these indie games and not kind of anchor it in terminology. So the plus of that would mean that we wouldn't be haunted by Dungeons and Dragons. On the other hand, we'd lose a lot of the kind of definitional stuff that would be really useful. So it might be that we instead have to lean into things that are written about interactive fiction and other kinds of related genres instead. So that's one option, or one branch along the forking trees, right? The other option is to lean in and just say, you know what? Dungeons and Dragons did really start all of this off. There's a reason why D&D is the touchstone. And we're just going to rip off the Band-Aid, and we're just going to do the initial dive into D&D, and that's how a lot of us get here. And so why make an artificial space where, students with no background, don't get the kind of mooring of D&D. So the other option is just to say, okay, we're going to run a game of D&D. We're going to make characters. We're going to read the history of D&D. I mean the history of D&D in all of its facets, right? As I'm going to talk about next week, to talk about the history of D&D is to talk about the history of lots of people, some of whom get credit and have always gotten credit, and some people who have not always gotten credit, particularly female-identified people. And so just to kind of say, all right, this is the background, this is what half the class already knows and the other half doesn't, and we'll put our powers combined and we'll create community through that shared immersion. And then that potentially becomes me talking to the students this semester, especially the ones who are thinking about I want to write a new campaign as an unessay, and say, okay, do that for my next class. Write the one shot or the series of one shots that can be played in 75 minutes that include character formation that will allow new players to kind of hit the ground running in the space of class. Who knows? It's possible. I feel odd about that because I really want to represent the full spectrum of tabletop role-playing games. Many indie and many developers lament the fact that D&D is so often seen as the touchstone. And so the question is, can we defer it, or will we always be haunted because there's always going to be people in the room bringing up D&D even if I don't? Or do we lean into it so that we can catapult away from it as quickly as possible? I don't know which is the answer. And I think that's the thing about teaching is, that's why you teach a class multiple times in order to kind of figure out how it works. But that's where we are. And unless, in the next year or two, D&D falls off the face of the earth, which seems unlikely, that's kind of the choice that needs to be made. So that's Teaching Corner for this Tuesday. I'm still having a super amount of fun, even though the world's on fire and it feels increasingly, anxious, and, we are feeling lots of feelings in the space of class that run the full gamut. But as always, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to put questions or feedback in the comments. Keep it civil, please. You can always tweet at me at FRIEDE. And of course, my students can find me on Discord and in class, and I look forward to talking more. See you on Thursday.